It's Firearms Friday at the Wyoming State Museum in Cheyenne. I'm firearms historian Evan Green, and I want to do a shout out to those of you who have followed this channel and these videos for the last 5 years. I really appreciate it, and I'm doubly grateful for those of you who take the trouble to make some comments, because you've helped me with excuse me. You've helped me with identification of some firearms. You've caught my mistakes and corrected them. You've educated me on things that I didn't know about. And you've made suggestions about improving these videos. And one of those suggestions, which, why didn't I think of this 5 years ago? Someone said, gee, it would be really nice if when you're talking about a firearm, you showed the cartridges that it used. Well, it's too late for me to go back and do that on existing videos, but maybe this will make up for that a little bit, because I am planning a series on cartridges. And I thought a good place to start would be kind of post-Civil War, when the United States military made the transition from muzzle-loading rifle muskets, like this one, to firearms that were breech loading and used a self-contained metallic cartridge. So this is an 1861 contract musket made by the Colt Firearms Company. You probably know that at the start of the Civil War, after the firing on Fort Sumter in 1861, that neither the Confederates nor the Union had sufficient firearms to supply their troops. So a couple things happened. One was that any manufacturer, any firearms manufacturer who could make guns was put under contract to build them. And this is an example of one of those. There was a contract with Colt Firearms. The other thing that happened is that both sides scoured Europe for firearms that they could import into the country to use in the war. So we imported, both sides imported firearms. They came from Britain, they came from France, they came from Belgium, they came from Austria, which explains how some of the firearms in our collection here arrived in the country and eventually made their way to Wyoming. So anyway, here's this Colt 1861 musket. And again, that there were so many different firearms on both sides. Some of the Southern volunteers showed up with flintlock squirrel guns and muzzle-loading shotguns. But there was an attempt on both sides to standardize a caliber, and they settled on 58. So here we have a 58 round ball and a 58 Minet or mini ball. This weighs 250 grains. This weighs twice as much, over 500 grains. So the Minet or mini ball really revolutionized tactics on the battlefield. It was invented by a Frenchman and was first used in the Crimean War against the Russians. France, Britain, and I think the Ottomans were involved in that Crimean War, and there was an American there, an observer, who saw how efficient and how deadly the mini ball was, and brought the concept back to the United States, made some minor changes. Now, the thing about using rifled firearms, muzzle-loading rifled firearms in combat, is the difficulty in loading them. Because like your Kentucky rifle or the rifled guns used in the Revolutionary War, very few, in order for the bullet to engage or the ball to engage the rifling, it was surrounded by a linen patch, and that had to be forced down the barrel to be seated on the powder. And seating that ball got more and more difficult as the firearm was used and the bore became fouled. The mini ball solved that problem because it has this hollow base. So it is slightly smaller than the bore of the rifle. So it's easy to use the ramrod to push it down against the powder. But when the powder detonates, this narrow rim of soft lead expands to engage the rifling. And again, it changed tactics on the battlefield. Because before, when the troops were armed with a smoothbore musket, shooting a musket ball like this one without rifling, the effective range was maybe 50 to 75 yards, and it was often used in mass fire. An individual soldier might never have actually aimed at the enemy, at the opposing troops. Everybody just went boom at the same time and shot into the ranks of the approaching troops. And because the range was limited to that 50 to 75 yards, the troops charging the fixed works would fire their firearms and at 50 yards fix bayonets and charge the works. Well, the Menet ball allowed an effective range of 200 to 300 yards. So that was way too far to do a bayonet charge. There's a famous incident at Spotsylvania Courthouse where a Union general named Sedgwick was out with his officers kind of looking over the battlefield. And one of his officers said, Sir, we're way too close to the Confederate lines. We need to back away. And Sedgwick says, Don't worry, boys. They couldn't hit an elephant at this range. Those were his last words because a Confederate sniper, probably using a Menet ball, shot him right out of the saddle. So again, it was a major change to tactics on the battlefield. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the accoutrements here. I mentioned bayonets. This is a socket bayonet that fits over the muzzle of the musket, rifled musket, and kind of locks around that front sight and can be tightened up with a set screw here. So again, called a socket bayonet, and these continued in use through the era of the Springfield trapdoors. So since we're talking cartridges, let's look at some. These are reproductions, these are not original. But this is a paper cartridge. It's tied with string on one end, and it contains one of these 500 grain mini balls and 60 grains of black powder. So the procedure would be to tear open this paper cartridge, put the powder down the barrel, and then seat the mini ball against the powder. And they came in packages of 10, like this, again, tied with string. This was evidently before Velcro. So a part of your kit would have been this cartridge pouch that was lined with these tin boxes to hold your cartridges. So this would again have been a part of the stuff that you carried on what was the Civil War equivalent of your web gear. Okay, so after the Civil War, it became apparent during the Civil War that fixed cartridge firearms were the future. In 1860, both the Spencer repeater and the Henry repeater were patented. 1860. The Spencer held 7 rounds in the buttstock, was a kind of a lever action thing, but the hammer had to be cocked. And the Henry held 15 cartridges in a tube under the magazine and was the forerunner of all of the subsequent Winchester firearms, the lever action firearms. So, okay, Civil War is over. You know that we need breech loading firearms that take a fixed cartridge, and you got maybe 1 million of these old rifled muskets. What should we do? So there were at that time multiple people who patented mechanisms to convert the muzzle loader to a breech loader. The one that was successful was by a guy named Erskine Allen. Allen was the senior gunsmith at the Springfield Armory, and his trapdoor mechanism was successful and went on to father a generation of trapdoor breech-loading rifles. There were other people who had patents, and me being suspicious of government, I wonder if they didn't pick Allen because he was a federal employee and they wouldn't have had to pay royalties to a private individual. Okay, I'm going to set this one aside. This is a trapdoor Springfield. It's a model 1868. We do not have in the collection the first and second iteration of the Allen conversions, unfortunately. The first Allen conversion, again, and the Allen patent was this trapdoor mechanism. And the first versions had some issues that were resolved in his second conversion. But the first one fired this copper cartridge, 58 caliber, loaded with a Manet ball and probably that same 60 grains of black powder. So the second iteration of the Allen conversion involved boring out that 58 caliber barrel and inserting a 50 caliber sleeve. And the cartridge that was used in that conversion was the 50-70 cartridge. And again, this is a copper cartridge, and it's internally primed. External primers, boxer primers, Berdan primers were still a few years in the future. But the base looks like it could be a rimfire and is often mischaracterized as a rimfire. But it is, in fact, a centerfire with a internal primer. One of the internal primer inventors was a guy named Benet, again a Frenchman, and a lot of the early military cartridges in the United States were internally primed with Benet primers. Alrighty, so we've now addressed the end of the Civil War and the conversion of these muskets, muzzle-loading muskets to breech-loading. And again, they had a million of those muzzle loaders in storage. The treasury was depleted. They just finished a very expensive Civil War. So the successful idea was to convert them to breech loading. So that's the transition. If you have any questions or comments, you can enter them below. If you want to talk about firearms or history or Wyoming, you can call the museum at their direct number. They'll take a message and I will get back to you. So, thank you for watching.